Welcome to the Nostalgia Hour for those of you born between 1975 and 1986. This is a bonus episode and very much a conversation that I wanted to share with others. I've known Ellen for a few years. She's one of my brother's closest friends, and as a result, she maintains the UX coach theme of having music and DIY ethics at the root of your value system. We talk about finding yourself in life, changes in mindsets towards work, and art over time. Ellen and I have a shared life experience with dreams of being music journalists, running record labels, and being on tour, only to find ourselves becoming a slave to the wage. Ellen shares her experiences of being immersed in subcultures and how this place of being still directs and influences her work and finding the environments that she can thrive in. You'll have to excuse the banging and other background noise. It is the season for DIY in the literal sense everywhere in England as we were recording this. Please forgive me for audio. I wanted to be able to share as much of this as possible with you. So strap in. This is very much something which I hope you can have in the background, and some of the things you'll chime as you drift in and out, which I guess is how most people listen to podcasts these days. So let's get on with the show.
I'm in sunny Penge, which is in South London. It's glorious today. It's a really nice Friday morning, lots of sunshine. I am South London through and through, always been in this neck of the woods, to be honest. So yeah, very, very London-centric.
Did you grow up in London as well?
So basically, until I was 8, I was a couple of roads away from where I live now, which is good, shameful, weird. It's weird. But then when I was 8 and I changed school, I moved to Croydon, which London Borough of Croydon, so technically still London, but very Croydon. So yeah, I'm a Croydon girl. Did you not know that? I am so Croydon.
I didn't, and now it's all becoming clear. My experiences of Croydon have been very limited to a site visit for a potential supplier once that was in, is it called One Croydon, the 50p building?
Oh, that iconic, yeah. I don't know officially what it's called, but yeah, 50p building, threepenny bit. Yeah, brutalist icon.
I've been there. I picked someone up there on the way to a festival once out of the goodness of my heart, and was perplexed because I ended up ringing them and going, I'm on a tram line.
Yes,
and
we
I was
have
a bit
trams.
confused by the fact that there was trams in Croydon.
Oh yeah, we have trams.
That's it. And then going and seeing This Morning with Richard and Not Judy, which must have been 1996 or something crazy at the Fairfield?
Yeah,
Hall?
yeah. Still there. Fairfield Halls is still there. Yeah. It's a good place. It's a good place to grow up. Being near to London, but in like your own specific place is quite good, and it makes you quite resilient if you're from a sort of widely like laughed at place. I think you become quite sort of immune to it, and then you can take the mick out of Croydon as well, which is really good. No one else can. I love it. I am the Croydon ambassador.
So where do you go after Croydon? You, I guess you did the whole university shtick.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I went a very traditional path. So I went to university in Birmingham, where I studied English. Like literally, now I look back on it, the little thought I put into my university degree subject is hilarious. But yes, I wanted to go and read books for 3 years, which I think a lot of content people probably spent their time doing as well. And I was there when, same as you, right? The fees weren't so bad. Definitely not what they are now. So I could just go and faff around in Birmingham. And I wanted to go to Birmingham because it is the home of metal. So I was like, this has got a great music scene. It's where Black Sabbath are from. It's where Napalm Death are from. Napalm Death were still hanging out in pubs when I was there. So yes, I chose basically not really for the university, but more because I knew it had a good music scene. So yeah, I went and did that.
Well, you were looking for like a grimy subculture.
Oh yeah.
Because Birmingham's hardly like cosmopolitan from my limited experiences of being there.
Do you know what? I really did choose Croydon to Birmingham. Like, for people who aren't UK-centric, you might be like, oh, they sound like nice places, but they are. The reputations do precede them. But yeah, I wanted I mean, Birmingham's university is brilliant. Like, definitely a red brick. What's the word for that group of universities? Russell, is that still a thing? The Russell Group. So really good English.
The Russell Group.
Yeah, I applied to Oxford. I didn't get in. That's a story for another time. We're not being recorded. But the Birmingham, for me, for my time at Birmingham and university was very much like finding myself. So I got really heavily into the music scene. I put on gigs. I wrote for like fanzines. Started a label when I left university, worked at a festival when I was there, and like worked at like some really amazing promoters. So for me, it was like I found my crew who weren't necessarily like the university people that I met. Like one of my best friends now, I met there because she was from Birmingham, and we would go to gigs all the time, and the grimy pub gigs, not the like, I mean, sometimes we'd go to a big gig, but mostly it was the grimy pub gigs. So yeah, that's how I got into like hardcore punk.
Amazing. So for the context, music is just naturally going to find its way into this conversation throughout, I think, whether we like it to or not. And that's because I met Ellen through my brother, who is also a musician. He's a musician and an artist and a scientist and all of the things in between, I think. Dr. Matthew Parker, who also spent some time in Birmingham. We met through him at a Converge gig, so that sets a bit of context for it. But I think that there is also something in this that I find interesting, because throughout this entire experience of creating this podcast, the number of people who I have interviewed that have been involved in user experience design that have very close ties within the music industry or that sort of like alternative music culture is massive. I'd say it's probably on like a 90% ratio of the people I've interviewed have got some kind of connection.
That's so many. I love it.
It's strange, isn't it? So there's obviously something there about, I don't know whether it's counterculture, because it's very rarely mainstream music that people are into. It's something that's slightly on the fringes or completely out there. There's got to be some kind of connection there. So you're studying English. There's this sort of love for the art of wordsmithery, and if you're listening to hardcore punk, it's all about the message. How do you sort of move on from there and find yourself to, let's bridge that gap. So right now, what's your job title today?
So my job title today is, I'm going to rephrase it as UX writing manager, but actually my official job title is experience writing manager, which sounds quite wild. But yeah, I work for John Lewis, so the John Lewis Partnership, which, if you're not familiar with it, is John Lewis is probably like it's probably one of the remaining like department stores in the UK, but the partnership as a whole is also responsible for includes Waitrose, so a supermarket, and we also do finance. So yeah, I sold out, man. I work for the man. I'd say, yeah, the punk ethos, the DIY background is I completely agree with you. There's tons of people from music who then worked through, and you could probably do like a whole chat about why did DIY kids end up in like user-centered design, and I think that's a really, really good route. It does still play out. So the partnership where I work now, it has got like extremely democratic values. It's built as a partnership, so all the employees own the business. So I feel like I'm still maybe clinging on to it, and I do wrangle. I talked about it really recently with someone else. Like, I really wrangle with this like duality of growing up and being an extremely like righteous, thinking I was extremely righteous. I mean, I'm a white girl from Croydon, trying to be really right on, and then at the end of it, like, I had to get a job. Like, I had to sort of go on a path of capitalism. I need a job. I need to pay my rent. So that's sort of how I fell into the world of like content, really. So it sounds really ungracious now. It was a kind of chosen path. But yeah, I mean, for a long time, I was like, I want to be a music journalist. I was like, I want to write about grimy bands and go and see bands and maybe run a record label. Turns out music journalism is not the easiest route. And also, like, especially now, God, thank God, I think I wouldn't have survived that. So yeah, so when I actually started looking for jobs, the world of online content was mega and was booming. So there was so many jobs with like content editor in the title. And I think it was just being the right place in like 2006, which was when I was graduated in 2005, started looking for jobs in 2006. Content was everywhere. So it kind of dictated, sort of made a path, which obviously now I'm really glad it worked out. But for a while I was a bit like, oh my God, I'm going to be churning out weird web content for the rest of my life, which was an interesting route.
Like you say, that period of time, is that still classified as sort of like the emergence of Web 2.0? I suppose it is, isn't it? It's beginning of e-commerce and things really starting to move. The BBC website was like a big deal. Well, you've got not too far around the corner is the first ever social media platform, which is now, I don't even know what it is, a collection of bad photos, but MySpace is not far around from that. And I guess you've got all of those other things that came into it. Picking up on something that you've already sort of said, which is about you wrote fanzines and got involved in music in that kind of way. And I actually had to explain to someone a couple of weeks ago what a fanzine was, because I had said the same thing. I was like, well, I've done all of these things in my life. My life hasn't just been doing this job. And one of those was fanzines. And they were like, what's that? And I was like, well, it's like a website that you make for yourself, but it's paper and you use Pritt stick and like cut out random bits and photocopy them excessively until they look really bad. And then you kind of pile it all together, and some random person that picked your details off the back of NME or Kerrang in the free ads said that they would send you a stamp so that you could get it. And they're like, this sounds wild. What is this? But there's, again, it's that creative aspect, isn't it, in the artistry? And like you say, so I worked for a whole load of magazines of Rock Sound, and then moving online to things like Drowned in Sound and Pitchfork. And then I was one of the main reviewers for Thrash Hits, which was sort of like a splinter thing off of Drowned in Sound. And yeah, none of us made any money. We barely managed to pay for the servers. And if it's still up now, it will only be because Hugh and Razik, the guys that were sort of running it, are still paying for it somewhere by accident. That because it was just so expensive. That's all we really did it for. So we all hit that point of needing to get the coin.
Also, like, I did it for free gig tickets, and you got free CDs. Like the number of CDRs or the number of like CDs in like little paper wallets to review. And I remember getting given like the first Arcade Fire album to review and being like, wow, this is great. And I remember all the like other people I was reviewing. I mean, obviously I was into metal, but I was also into like weird indie music as well. So like hearing new stuff like that, like bands that are now absolutely huge, was like a really, really special time. But for me, it wasn't sustainable, and it was just not going to be like, it's a labor of love. And I think the thing about doing it for like choosing it as a career path, then for me, I was very much like, I need to go and get paid. But I mean, God, I still like, I loved it for so long. But the emergence of social media was such a, like, I was thinking about it the other day. So I was working for MSN, RIP, just MSN doesn't exist anymore, does it? But MSN, literally when Twitter launched, and I remember going like in work and setting up like the MSN shopping Twitter account and stuff like that. And you're like, when you're trying to explain that to someone who's like under 30, and they'll be like, what are you talking about, grandma? You know that meme of they're taking the grandma and being like, shut up, grandma. And someone holding up, doing a training course at MSN, and someone holding up like a really, really, I mean, their phone, and being like, in the future, everyone's going to be reading MSN on their phones. And I was like, this is nuts. When obviously no one's reading MSN now, but like that emergence when like so much was changing so rapidly, and it was just such a, that was quite a weird time. But it was churning out content for an advertising vehicle. So I mean, it is what it is. But I wrote a music blog for MSN. For MSN Music. So that was it was still vaguely creative in my own way, but working for Microsoft. So there you go.
Let's talk about content design, and specifically content design and UX writing. So that we've had a few people as guests previously who've worked within the content space. And when we were talking the other day, saying that one of the main things that I feel like we've covered off 100 times. I'm not going to ask you to do again. Is what is content design and what makes it different to content strategy and copywriting? There's this additional element that you introduced here, which is UX writing, which is something that we haven't really talked about before. What's the relationship with these terms? Is it a subset of a thing? Is it something that's very distinct? Is it a particular skill set? Can we compare it to something else? Is it about you work in the content space and it's the same as if you're a UX designer, you might be really good at information architecture, but not so great at graphic design, that kind of thing? How does it relate?
I think so, yeah. I think the way you're sort of explaining it in relation to UX design is quite a useful way. I think generally in the industry, and even within like the content world, they're really used like really interchangeably, which leads to quite leads to maybe a little bit of confusion. And even though I do have technically UX writing in my job title now, I think I would consider myself generally more of a content person, and I align more closely with content design. Whether I can change my job title, that's an interesting, different conversation. But I think UX writing is perhaps more to do with like a level of Zoom, and maybe it is a subset of activities within content design where you're really, really focused on content and copy within a journey. Maybe not necessarily though designing the journey at the zoomed out level that the content designer will be. But then I say that, and then you typically any UX writer you speak to, I think, will probably tell you, oh no, I do the journey design and I do all the research activities and all the stuff that a content designer will do as well. So that's where it gets really blurry. And actually the reality will be much more nuanced and much more sort of open to interpretation. And the thing I really hammer about with UX writing quite a lot, and it is definitely my bugbear at the moment, I think the interpretation of UX writing often, or the perception of it with lots of people you might work with, is that UX writing is just about brevity or cutting things down or making things short. And I really am like rallying against that hugely at the moment. So it will include style and grammar and tone of voice and like all those typical content copywriting things and accessibility and inclusivity and that good stuff. It really can get into like a really specialized form of like usability. So as an example, one conversation I was having this morning was around the use of, what's the word for these words? Possessive adjectives. Is that right? So my and your. So in a UI you might have my all over the place, and then some other websites say have excessively used like your in labels and things like that. I think a UX writer's specialism will really come into like what is best and what's the right scenario for things like that. So it is generally the more micro copy side of the world, whereas the content designer and content designers I imagine you've spoken to probably will tend to be more about much closer to a UX designer, right? They're much more like, I'm going to do user-centered design. I am just coming at it from the angle of the content. The problem is you look at a job description for a UX writer and you can look at one for a content designer and they could literally be either, as far as like big companies are concerned. Could be one or the other. I'm not married to either. I would just say strongly I'm not a copywriter, but that's my own bugbear.
See, it seems to me like there's a problem here that is that around the term that's being used is incredibly specific. Writing is a singular form. Content, that there's this great like acknowledgement that content is a catch-all because everything is the contents of the thing. Writing is words. We don't write a picture. We don't write a photograph. We don't write we write the script for a film, but we don't write a film. So maybe that's part of the challenge here. And because I think it works in the other direction as well. There's an awful lot of people that work in content who have really no sense or understanding of mixed media. They do words, which I know is a dirty term for a lot of people, but they do words. That's it. They're copywriters that don't want to admit to being copywriters.
Completely. And it's really, really hard because you don't want to correct someone every time they refer to you in a meeting and say, oh, we'll get the copywriters involved, and you're like inside you're dying and you're like, oh my god, you're just ignoring like 90% of what I spend my time. A very small part of my day is actually writing. And also the problem with that as well is obviously everyone can write. So this is where we really interface with people who will go down the route of like, oh, we could just put some placeholder in there and then you can have a look later on and you can just tweak it and work your magic and stuff like that. Or we don't want to necessarily go down the AI chat, but like, oh, we'll just get Chat GPT to write it. And then I appreciate that there's so much stuff that people can do without involving a UX writer or a content designer. Yeah, it does minimize the role a lot. And I think that's why lots of content people do get their back up a bit, and it's trying to do that, have that discussion in a really productive way. So while I'm jokingly saying like, oh, I don't want to be called a copywriter, it's because I think personally, I feel like that's not my biggest strength. And I've worked with really incredible like brand copywriters or people who just really like do that stuff at a different level to me. And I don't possess quite the same skills. And I think that's maybe why I to the content design side, because I love the research and the insight and that part of it. And that's why this whole world, like when it opened up to me and it was emerging and it was all fresh and shiny new, I was like, fuck yes, like this really like resonated so deeply with me. So I think it's a real like well told tale that content designers and UX writers like we bang this drum all the time. And I really want to be empathetic with that, because it's still an issue, it's still something we come up against, but also I feel like it's talked about a lot. So I'm just like, right, yeah, copywriters, no, please don't call me that. Or people, you put like any designer will get it when you say like, can you work your magic on this? And you're like, just don't talk about my work. And I don't think it's meant with malice, but it just lands so badly with me.
So do you think that graphic designers don't like it when you tell them that you're going to send them something and they just need to colour it in?
Yeah, it's hard. It's so hard. Like especially with UX, of course. Like you still get the view that your job is, like we talked about before, like do some wireframes with a big X in a box, and that's a picture, and you're like, oh my god. So yeah, but obviously that education. Content design as a job title has been around for like, I should have looked at the date before we started this conversation, 12 years maybe, 10 to 12 years, let's say. So it's still extremely emerging. Like it's still a new field. So we do have to do an amount of advocacy, and that's fine. It's just like, what's too much? Like I just can't sit in a meeting with a stakeholder who in bad faith is going to say something like, oh, we'll just get you to do the copy at the end. Like, I'm not going to have that conversation. Also, I'm too old. So I can't face it. I'm not like, no, dude, I'm not at this stage now in my career. I'm like, not gonna entertain that, I guess.
Yeah, don't need to be having those kinds of conversations. Before we talk about the advocacy side of things and that maturity aspect of the job, I wanted to ask you about what the process or the methods that are used that actually do make it something different to being a copywriter, because that's where I think the missing link might be. So if I think about UX design and what a UX designer is and why a UX designer is not an interface designer or a graphic designer, so understanding behavior, and we don't talk about that anywhere near enough anymore. That's something I've noticed a lot in UX design, particularly in the last year of meeting lots of different people working in UX. No one's actually talking about human behavior, which was the whole point in the first place. So it's that focus on understanding behavior to be able to create something that matches that behavior. And then you produce something that you think works, and then you run experiments to see whether you're right. Is that process and mindset still within that content design and UX writing? Is that what makes it different to being a copywriter?
Yeah, 100%. It's exactly that same approach. So I do have my explaining what it is for internal stakeholders, which I have on standby in case I need to like whip out the presentation. And that presentation always starts with explaining that UX writing is content which focuses on usability. So we do exactly the same activities, more or less, not exactly obviously, but there's similar activities around gathering your research, gathering your insight from a content point of view, which I think tends to be like misunderstood, not necessarily misunderstood, tends to be sort of like really reduced to let's look at some competitors and let's just add our tone of voice and things like that. But the problem, I think, like being a content designer in 2024 is very much like we're shifting into the world of, we had such a great talk about this yesterday at work, to do with like trust, to do with empathy, to, like you said, human, bringing it back to being human centered. We'll do the same activities which involve like research, whether it's like qualitative, doing those interviews with customers, interviews with users. I am a big, like, I did before I went off to read books for 3 years, I did sort of toy with the idea of doing math. So I'm a big numbers, like quantitative data and old school analytics, like that kind of, I still love that side of it as well. So I will be confident to look at like content analytics. So we'll gather all that data, all that insight, the same way a product or a UX designer would, but use it to shape like the content experience. So if you have a really excellent content designer, they will be able to, not necessarily not an excellent one couldn't, but like being able to use the same tools as Figma is, like Figma, are so much more valuable than, like, for example, working in a Google Doc or working in a copy document. So I'm sort of, we're doing, I'd say it could be 90% on paper. You could go through the checklist of what a UX designer does, and you could say, oh yeah, that's what a content designer does as well. But yeah, and then testing, like you said, and experimenting with content is actually much more lightweight. I think maybe product managers forget that you can do a lot with content that could have like such powerful results. So trying to sort of bring that into it without being like, you have to redesign the whole experience and you have to change the layout and you have to like move everything around. It's like, why don't you just try 2 different CTAs? Like, that level of experimenting feels so light but could be so much more powerful. So we really want to advocate for those kinds of experiments, which don't necessarily need to be like heavy going or involve like lots of development effort. So it could be much more effective and much quicker as well. One thing that can really come through with content design and with UX writing is the huge piece around inclusivity and to do with accessibility. So it'd be bad not to talk about that probably, but just like simplifying, like simple language, making things accessible to all, like simplifying your content is one of the easiest ways you can do that. And a content designer, I think most copywriters are sort of very aware of these principles as well, but a content designer will really, really advocate for this, not the plainest English, God, that's excellent English, Ellen, but speaking in simple terms, those kind of things, writing as you would speak, for example, those are the activities which a content designer will absolutely bring to the table. Generally, I'd say a copywriter, if you are, for example, in a brand copy team or marketing or working on the advertising side of things, your role is really, you take a brief, you create the content, you create excellent copy, you write to the tone of voice, you write to the brief, you write achieving all your objectives. But your objectives are really like a sort of self-contained thing. You're not necessarily viewing it as part of a user's mission. I'm at John Lewis now. I've come to the John Lewis website to buy a dishwasher. That's not necessarily on the radar of a copywriter who's like, right, I'm going to write an excellent piece of editorial about women's jackets for spring, which, by the way, I love. I read all that stuff. But like, they're two, content is just like you sort of mentioned or alluded to earlier. It's all words, yes, and we all work together. And I've sort of tried to create a great relationship with like my brand and creative counterparts, because I think it's really important that you sort of obviously want to align. But yeah, they're just different. Like, I think that you said it, if we get into the maturity discussion, I think a real sign of user-centered design, UX, whatever, maturity is understanding like all these different levels of content are quite different things. And we're not just like this one big nebulous thing of copy, which then you're just like, oh my God, what a mess. Like, you would not say that to a designer. So yeah.
So what do you think needs to change to be able to move into the next era or the next phase of maturity? Because you've already inadvertently exposed the siloing that I think is a massive problem, which is if you go to an agency today, if you were hiring an agency as a company, or even if you were to go and work for an agency as a company, creative is the term that's used. That's the agency we use for creative. What the fuck does that mean? Because we're all creating stuff. So is that it? I know what it means. It's derogatory. It's graphic design. So how do we... Hell, I'll even throw in there that maybe it's people that make videos as well. But that's ultimately what it is. There's all the other stuff that comes into that. Do these like siloed factions need to start merging together? Because I always think about this. It's the same with UX design, really. And even within UX design, there's fracturing now where you reach a certain size of organization. And I still have it, by the way. I'm going to now repeat an analogy that we were talking about the other day, and it's going to be lost entirely because I haven't found the new version yet. This is my hi-fi separates analogy. So the UX designer is the person who buys the hi-fi that has a tape deck and a graphic equalizer and a radio and a CD player, and maybe it's got a record player on the top of it, and it's all one solid box and it does everything okay. Maybe it's got one of those things that's really good and the rest of them are just, they're good. And then you've got this specialisms thing where you've got graphic designers and stuff like that. And that's the person that goes and buys a very specific amp and a set of speakers and a record deck and a tape deck and all the rest of it. Isn't that where we are now with this? If we've got content designers, we've got the creatives, we've got graphic designers and illustrators and everything else. And these are all these specialist components, but we haven't given it a name for the thing that it all lives in. So they're all sitting in different bits, and maybe that creates other problems because it sits in different parts of the business. And have you come up with an alternative yet? A 24?
No, I'm sorry. I'll try. I'll think about. I'll ponder that. I am the wordsmith anyway.
That's the only reason I got you here.
I'll think about it and then I'll charge you.
Okay.
It's really fractured. It is. It's really hard because I think I've worked really small places where the content manager, old school job title there, does everything. So you are the SEO copywriter, the brand copywriter, essentially what was like the product copywriter. You do all of it. You are the content person. I'm not saying that's better, but then you go to a big organisation which has an SEO copywriting team, completely separate, doing their own thing, on an arm, not really speaking to anyone. Product copywriters, which is not product as in the way we work, so not productized as in, I'm talking about like PDP, like I'm going to write the description for an oak table. I spend my day writing descriptions for products. That's another one. Then we have the brand and editorial team. Then we have the help customer services team, and then we have like me and my team. That's too fractured. So it is a massive challenge. It's a huge challenge. And it is obviously that you do the good stuff of like trying to create those relationships and build a network and do the influencing where you go out with your presentation and you explain user-centered design and you explain accessibility and you explain why not to use click here and links and things like that to really try and elevate everyone's experience so that at least we're trying to join the dots a tiny bit. But you are still fractured. You are still the separates and you are still not necessarily operating together as a unit. So yeah, what is the future for that? Is in short, I don't know, Andy.
What would you like it to be?
I think there is a really strong case for bringing it together, if only for efficiency. So having one, I am thinking very much in the content space, but having the function which just does not view those things as separate. If nothing else, it will save me time having to, that's a page that's maintained by the other team who have access to AEM and do the editorial stuff. So I have to message them. And also their processes are very different to our processes. So they don't, I think one central world for that stuff is the utopia and is where we're all living in harmony. But I think that does require such an amount of like investment and sort of unpicking, especially in big companies, you really, really will have to unpick entrenched ways of working that are perhaps at odds with, not at odds with, it's like very different to if you've been used to working in small, agile product teams, you work way differently to someone who's used to getting a briefing form and creating their content. So yeah, I think there's a future for that, but it's really hard. It's really hard to picture it because I think there's no easy way, and that's why you end up with situations where like companies will go out and bring in an agency, or they'll outsource one part of it, or they'll do that kind of thing because generally that seemed easier. The thing I'm really interested in and exploring at the moment, which is a really common thing content designers advocate for, is to get invited to projects or work at the beginning. So like I said earlier, you don't want to get there at the end and be like, I've created this experience and here's the lorem ipsum and you go and fill it in. So content designers have been banging the drum for a while, like, get me in at the beginning, let me help you shape the experience. The thing I'm working on at the moment is even a step earlier than that. So it's getting the UX, as I am now a UX writer, getting myself in really to like the proposition development stage. The thing you get landed with, I think this is the same for UX designers more broadly, you've been given a product or you've been given a proposition to work with that you're like, I should have got involved earlier. This does not necessarily, I can't make sense of something that you've created that still doesn't quite make sense to me, let alone how am I meant to design this? I mean, it's almost like a level of service designing. Even getting UX writers in, that's where I think the really interesting work is happening now. So involved with like proposition development, proposition naming, actually doing the marketing, the market research, let alone the user research. So I'm kind of like really interested in that space at the moment, and how, let alone the content mess that I've just referred to, let alone like trying to think about that. It's like, oh God, how do you even elevate it even further? So basically, I don't have a solution to the first problem, and I'm making it worse by saying we should be involved in everything.
Maybe that is because that is the direction that things need to go in.
Yeah,
there's always
I don't know.
the argument of you haven't been involved in something sooner, and it doesn't matter where you are in that stage. I know from actually seeing it in very recent times, there are still organisations that are working in a way that I thought everyone had actually stopped working in 15 years ago. And it's chucking stuff through gated processes, thrown over the wall. And yeah, we might call it XP or waterfall project management and stuff like that, but it's not. It's a very laggard way of looking at work as a manufacturing process, and that we don't actually need to work like that anymore. If I think back to the times when I was experiencing that firsthand all day, every day, it involved sales teams pitching endlessly to clients that would get a graphic designer involved because they wanted some mood boards mocked up and some storyboards and some other stuff and some other assets, collateral that they could go in and try and impress. Which again is why I say it just feels so dated, because I can't believe that people even think about things in that way anymore from the other side of things when they're buying. And then they win the project and they have specced out this entire project, including the process and the timelines and everything else. And then UX, you're first up, you do all of the thinky planny bit, and you look at what they've sold and go, what fucking idiot sold this? So to address that situation, you then started the same argument that you've got right now, which is, well, I want to go to these pitch meetings because you're selling us up the river every time you go out the door.
Yeah.
So that starts to happen, and you bring problems forward. So it kind of begs the question as to what's the deal? What is the problem with businesses at the moment where there's a failure to actually see the whole and to recognize the value and benefit of everyone coming together at the beginning? It might be a case of that you're not needed full time, and no one said you were from day one, but that kickoff and working out what you're going to do, surely as a business leader, I want everyone's voice involved. You're all hired for very specific reasons because you have a very unique way of looking at something, and I want to bring all of those views and voices together create this big old melting pot of great stuff so that we've got an idea of what to do, and then you drop in and out when you need it. I think this is maybe like a business maturity thing that's the problem.
Oh yeah, it really is. Also, it's really hard because I have worked in so many big companies, so I'm so familiar with this. So obviously, if you've worked places that are like, you work in a small, nimble tech startup, you probably have different issues, right? But you would not face into this in the same way. But I have worked in I worked for Royal Mail, dude. That's like a 500-year-old, 600. How old is Royal Mail? So old, the oldest company in the world. Not literally, but it's not unique to Royal Mail. It's not unique to John Lewis. These are big companies with so many huge teams. So if you have your pocket of design, which we're very lucky to, we have a great design community, really, really good, great design leaders who really advocate for, like you said, elevating the designers and being like, you're expert in your area, you go off into your product teams, you shape your carved out experience. But your carved out experience is actually relatively quite small and not very defined. And then as soon as you come out of that, and as soon as you step out of that, that is where the problems are. And we all, I've had it so many places I've worked. It's not necessarily a problem, but you accept it because you look around and you think, we work this way, everyone else doesn't. And as soon as you have that realization, you're like, oh yeah. So yeah, it is about building the influence. Building the influence outside is so important. And it is, I think, having experience of those places is really useful, because I don't go in and try and fix everything or preach to them or say we work like this, isn't it great? Come on, and try and tell them what to do. They're not going to change for me being this sort of random imposter into their team. So I think you find other ways to cut through. So you have I have to build, like I said, I've literally spent 2 years building relationships with a couple of people just to at least create a network so that we know each other and we know how to work together. Long term, yeah, how do you take a company and say we're gonna flip it on its head? That's wow. That's why I don't get paid 7 figures because I don't what is the answer to that? So I think if you're confident and if you've been working, I'm 40 this year. I keep talking about it a lot because I'm talking about it so much because I'm accepting of it, and I'm just talking. Thank you. I keep mentioning it because I'm fine with it. It's great, isn't it? I can't wait. But I think the point is I've been working for long enough. I've been in full-time working for the man, sold out since I was 21. I've been working long enough that I've built up a level of confidence in getting into conversations or having conversations that otherwise might be shut off to me. And that is obviously acknowledging a level of privilege and a level of being able to do that, which obviously is it's very useful. It's quite exhausting having to do that. And after a while, if you say the example I'm talking about where I'm saying I'm trying to get into proposition development and trying to say let me help you shape this thing, because then it will make my job easier in the long run, because I will not have to design something or work on something that I'm I can't make sense of this. It's a really important skill to have, but what is the solution? Fuck, that's a big question, Andy.
It's time, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've recognised and described working on relationships in years, not the last couple of weeks I've been doing this. And I think there's a recognising of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of bring us to a close in the conversation, exploring that aspect a little bit. So we'd previously talked about how, as we have got older, your mindset changes, and there's a number of, I think there's actually a number of points in that first 20 years of adulthood where you are given choices. You can decide which direction you want to go in. And I think we all, if we're working within this creative space, and I think it comes from that advocacy element that we have from why do you write a fanzine? Why do you review these albums? It's because you actually want to share with other people. You want them to see amazing, wonderful things in this world and to be able to share the excitement that you have for it. And then I think you get into your early 30s and you think, I cannot be fucking bothered anymore. And then maybe you get a second wind in your 40s. I'm not sure if that's true. I haven't hit it yet, but maybe I will. But there's definitely this sort of like mindset shift. And I always had this feeling of when I was in my 20s, no one's listening to me. And then you get older and suddenly it's like, shit, actually, people do listen to you. Wow. So my hypothesis was correct. We live in this really broken ageist society. And now I'm thinking, I really want to, and one of the reasons why I put this podcast together, things have changed over time, but I wanted to give people who were me 20 years ago a platform. I wanted to listen to their ideas. I wanted to give them the opportunities to fail doing things in a different way to what I did. How does someone like yourself, who's in a good position where you're building a team, you have people who you can support, you're there, you're not necessarily accountable for them, but you want to give them the best opportunities they can to develop and evolve in their own way. How do these things sort of play together in your mind? What keeps you up at night when you think about the people on your team?
Yeah, it is. It's another big question. It's a really big thing, isn't it? People. And everyone, it's always the cheesy line, is like, why do you come to work? And you're like, it's the people. But yeah, it is. And I really value, I mean, I think personally, I've been lucky that I've had some really exceptional line managers who really did like shape my understanding of like what being a good manager looks like. And I think having spoken to people who've had the exact opposite, wow, like it makes such a huge, the impact it has on you is so like profound, and you become your model, your role model of how to behave with your team is really, really dictated by that. So I was very lucky in that way. But also I think having, you can't really reflect on how to deal with that stuff without thinking about like the last few years. So obviously like, living through, like managing a team through the pandemic was like so mind altering. Because for literally I remember one day, the first day of working from home, and that was when I was working for BT. So I had a much bigger team. So I was managing a team of like 10 or 11 content designers, like probably too many. But it became your day-to-day role was, what do they call it? Like the pastoral care, the having one-to-ones. Yeah, all that became my life, like literally overnight, like having one-to-ones with people who were not in various different ways, different reasons, like adapting to this new way of working and really like the new world. So I think acknowledging the shift that caused for a lot of people, and it's really accelerated like a new attitude to remote working, work-life balance, the stuff which for me anyway was like super important, because I am not a hustler, I am not I'm not a rising grinder, I am not a careerist person at all. So I think the things that the pandemic exposed, I was always really kind of like conversely grateful for, because I think it really did help. But then it's so bananas, isn't it? Like there's lots of places doing like a mandated return to the office 5 days a week. Like a couple of companies announced it this week. I think what I'm trying to get at is my expectations for my team are, you really like your job. Like we work, like you said, in a really creative space. We work with really good people day to day. A great company who have values I really admire. That stuff is all like big tick in my book, and I feel extremely lucky. And I want the team to feel that as well. And I have a very small team, but I like really want to get them to feel that. But also at the end of the day, like it is a job, full stop, like end of sentence. Like it is not your life. I do not live to work. And I appreciate like other people might have different views, and they are much more like motivated by like the grind and watching the TikToks about how to hustle and make £1 million, like fine. But I think just like having that mindset shift and thinking like having someone really model that behavior will hopefully help them really focus on the shit that matters. So like, I mean, I had a child during the pandemic, so like my wake up moment or shift in terms of like, like this, fuck, the world is burning, happened so quickly. Like it was intense. So I think then returning to work post-pandemic with a small child, you're shifted, and then you turn 40 and you just think, God, it's just a job. And I don't like, I say that with jest, but actually I do kind of mean it.
Yeah, but you didn't. At some point you didn't, right? This is what I keep checking myself on. I think I've hit the same kind of point now. Because I think back to the experiences that I've had where I've stayed in a job for longer than I should have done. And that has ended up meaning that the relationships within that company, because it's like you say, companies are people. You're with people that you work with. I don't think this is true today, but it was 3 years ago, or 2019. It was very true. You spend more time at work with complete random people than you do with anybody else in your life. It was really important, and you create meaningful relationships. I have friends today. I don't have friends from school, but I do still have friends that I talk to. Spoke to someone last night. I worked with them for 5 years. Best fucking 5 years ever because of working with them, not necessarily the company that I was at. And that's gone for people who are leaving school where they have had that. Okay, they might not have had it in the last few years, where you go somewhere every day and you spend time with people. And I do think that is something to raise a flag on and say, we're about to like socially and communally damage young people. Whilst I'm not totally sure on the whole mandating the office, why not? When did we suddenly decide that we were so fucking privileged that we get to decide where we work? So I think there's a balancing act to have, and it was something that you said the other day when we were talking about this, about mindful, the idea of like mindfulness or being a mindful leader is seeing on a number of occasions during the pandemic, people having a really hard time, and not just because of all of those environs, all those things going on, but because they were quite happy with their life, living with their four friends, where they all went to work and they all started their careers together, and it was very exciting, and going to the pub on a Friday. And now they were day in, day out, literally fighting for bandwidth to be able to work. I think it made me realize, again, as an older person, actually offices have a really important role. And whether you want to call it the grown-up creche or something else, I think there is a need for that, because otherwise we're going to end up with just complete social ineptitude. We're just not going to understand how to function with other people in a room.
I think the key is choice. So I think the key is flexibility. So I strongly disagree with mandated 5 days, especially mandated returns to an office which is not fit for purpose. So you have your like really old office with crappy internet, like worse internet than at home, and then there's not enough coffee machines, there's not enough desks. Like that's bananas. And you've got to do pick up in the drop off and pick up and blah 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 blah, make dinner. People with multiple kids, like wow, hard or caring responsibilities or different access needs. Like it's really tough. But yeah, choice. Like why not have choice? Why not have flexibility? The choice is the answer. Like you said, there's people in our team who are like, the majority of our team is sort of probably around 30, like 30 years old. They would some are coming in 2-3 days a week. I mean, and it seems to work really excellently as a balance. Fridays in our office are dead, so you would not go anywhere near it on a Friday. But yeah, I think that's the key. And the thing with the community, creating the community and like really like helping nurture that, is definitely not just going to come from being in the office though. So I think in-person stuff is so essential. So I do hear you on that. Because since joining John Lewis, and I joined 2 years ago, so post-pandemic obviously, there's certain relationships that I've really spent time with and people with face-to-face, but there's tons that I haven't. So we're actually like proactively creating in-person things because I have not, as a group, like as a cohort, we haven't really spent time together. So yeah, I think acknowledging that culture and community isn't just by default. I think lots of people just think, oh, it just happens magically and you have some nice people and it'll just like randomly appear. So really being quite intentional in like, how is that created?
You've got to be part of it. And again, I think brings us into a nice full circle. I think these are the things which I still take from my teenage years and my early adult life of working in a music venue, booking events and stuff, and
Andy, this is so beautiful. This is like such a good neat bow on the end.
See
this
what
is
I did
so
there?
good.
That whole sort of point was, I remember, so I don't know whether I've ever talked about it in great detail on the show or not. It doesn't really matter. I worked for a music venue in my nearby town, which is the Forum in Tunbridge Wells.
Big ups. What a venue.
The thing that was drummed into me by them at the age of 18, actually 17 was when I first started working there, was that DIY ethos. If you want it, build it. If you want something to happen, make it happen. No one does anything for you. And that applies to everything. So I take that, I still have that, is a very strong core value of mine. So if I go into a new organisation, I am going to be the first person who says, oh, where do you live? Oh, okay, yeah. So you live nowhere near the place that we work at either. Cool. Where shall we meet? Because I don't think it's not the destination so much, right? It's not like a business is not that building, it's the people. So the people could be anywhere. So let's find a place to go and meet up. Let's go to Hackney and sit in the coffee shop and work together for the afternoon or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe that's where the future of work comes from, is actually being a little bit more proactive and thinking about the fact that it's not where you're going, it's who you're going there with.
It's just so beautiful. I don't know how to follow that. It's gorgeous. Yeah. Yeah, I am 100% a people person. I always like want to spend time chatting to people and chatting about nonsense and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, it's also about finding your people.
Yeah.
Isn't it? So you find, if you've got like a natural curiosity or a natural sort of like inquisitiveness, you will just like try and find those connections and like creating that network. That is 100% Ian Mackay DIY. Like that is it. Like you find your people.
I've avoided saying his name all the way through. Right from the beginning, I was thinking about it and I was like, no, I'm holding back.
Ian Mackay, you're mentioned on a UX podcast.
That's it. He has officially arrived.
Yeah.
You still can't buy a Fugazi t-shirt, but you've made it onto the UX Coach podcast. Congratulations.
I'm like, you should make bootlegs. Have you made merch? There you go. Oh, genius. We're going to do some photoshopping after this. This I feel really strong about. Like, I said it before when I did an event a couple of weeks ago, like finding your people who might not necessarily be like necessarily your peers or might necessarily be the people with huge influence. Like I always try and like create small pockets of networks because like I said to you when we did our first intro chat, I have intentionally music posters behind my behind me so that if someone happens to comment on it, I'm like, yes, let's talk about music. But it doesn't have to be music. Like I used it chat to someone else about the other day, like you find the person that's really into Drag Race, another huge passion of mine, and then you're like, oh, we have a Slack channel, do you want to join our private Slack channel about Drag Race? I'm like, yes. So I like I mean I have a big group of friends that I don't necessarily spend enough time with outside of work. So I'm not saying like your work people have to be your besties, like for real, definitely don't if you don't want to, but yeah, I want to make those connections, and I think you're right. That totally comes from like DIY because you just like you said, you end up meeting random people or meeting a band who's on tour from Nowheresville, America, and you're like, "Oh, come and sleep on my floor in my house in Birmingham." Looking back, I'm like, that's not very safe, is it?
So thank you for listening once again to the UX Coach podcast. This is the last time you'll hear from me for a while, because my life has very much taken a pivot that I was not expecting. But don't unsubscribe just yet. There's plans afoot for some new voices to take the mic and continue to share people's journey through careers in digital and whatever comes next in this post-AI bubble. And of course, until then, you can always find me at theuxcoach.com, where you can go back through the archive of the last 4 years worth of episodes and fascinating interviews with wonderful people from all over the world.